So today we're going to be talking about a topic that I find so freaking fascinating. If I had it my way, I would be able to teach an entire course on this topic. So when we talk about morality, we're really going to be focusing on a specific framework, and this is five moral foundations theory. This theory was developed by Jonathan Haidt, who you'll notice is the same guy who wrote that chapter that I assigned to you for Monday. And Haidt's theory is based on a couple of basic claims. One of them is that despite all of the apparent diversity in moral beliefs, right, morality can be about whether or not you're supposed to swear. Morality can be about the kind of food you eat. Morality can be about drug use. It can be about physical damage to other people, dishonesty, disloyalty. Haidt is claiming that this diverse spectrum of things can really all be fit into five basic categories, five basic moral themes. And he's also arguing that these five basic themes are each sort of designed to address a certain evolutionary challenge. So here are the five categories: harm/care, fairness/reciprocity, Ingroup/loyalty, authority/respect, and purity/sanctity. We're going to talk about each of these in detail. So let's start with harm/care. And you can really think of this as being about the way that we try to provide benefits for other people and prevent them from experiencing pain and discomfort and harm. In some ways, this is the most basic of the moral foundations. It's really almost this utilitarian perspective. We want what's best for other people, and we don't want harm to come for them. And you can really think of this as being embodied by the kind of investment in another person's well-being that you might see with parents and children. And it's really especially about protecting the vulnerable. So you might see echoes here of that social responsibility norm that we talked about just one class ago. Again, it has two parts, and one is about trying to avoid and prevent harm. You are impelled morally to not do things that emotionally or physically damage other people. It also has this demand that we help other people out when we can. So not just to passively avoid doing harm, but actively try to make other people's lives better. And Haidt argues that you can see just how kind of powerful and instinctive this foundation is by the strength of our caring urges that can be elicited even when we're talking about non-human creatures. All you have to do is see something soft and cuddly with big eyes, and you kind of have this impulse to care for it. And also, when you see somebody else, especially somebody vulnerable, and they're being attacked by someone else, they're being hurt or insulted or offended, we have this really strong instinctive impulse to defend and protect. Okay, the second foundation is fairness and reciprocity, and this is another very basic foundation. This is really about how we split up resources and these deep emotional reactions we have when we feel like a distribution of resources is unjust. And Haidt argues that this has to do with the way that we split up resources in small communities throughout our evolutionary history. It also has to do with navigating instances where you have to cooperate and rely on other people. You're trying to make sure you don't get exploited. So one of the things that this fairness norm compels us to do is to try to treat other people equally. So even when there's not overt harm involved, you shouldn't give some people preferential treatment. You shouldn't, for instance, when you're evaluating job applications, just because somebody is your friend or acquaintance, their application should not go to the top of the pile. It also impels us to not cheat, meaning to not break the rules, the kind of mutually understood rules of how a system is supposed to work. You shouldn't cheat on an exam to get an A grade, even if it doesn't actually hurt somebody else. You shouldn't violate a contract you have with another person in order to get just a little bit more money or benefit out of them. And you can really see this norm being activated in the kind of outrage that people might have or the resentment they might have when they feel like some people are ending up with a lot more benefit than others. Again, this is distinct from just wanting to avoid harm. Even if you don't necessarily see anybody suffering, you'd still be resentful if some people seem to be getting way more benefits than others. And again, we really especially dislike unequal benefits when it seems like some people are able to play by a different set of rules than other people. I want to note here that fairness can mean very different things depending on the context. So sometimes fair distribution of resources does mean precise equality. Everybody gets the same amount. And this might be the norm when, for instance, you're splitting up food. Everyone gets the same size slice of cake. Other times, fairness means proportionality. So this might be more common, for instance, when we're talking about salaries or grades. You probably think that it's okay for some people to get paid more than other people, as long as it's commensurate with the difficulty of their job and the amount of skill that's involved. And sometimes this can actually mean equity. So providing some people with more because those people started out with less, or their needs are more profound. And so you're trying to achieve equality of outcome rather than equality of distribution. This might remind you a little bit of Fiske's 4 models of relationship. So equality probably corresponds to equality matching. Proportionality might be looking a little bit like market pricing or authority ranking. And equity might sound a little bit like communal sharing. The third foundation is Ingroup loyalty. And this really has to do with our sense that it's right and it's noble to really support the groups that we're a part of, to root for them, to champion them, to act in their best interest, in the same way that you might consider it really positive thing for somebody to have a strong sense of school spirit. And Haidt argues that having this moral norm of loyalty is about maintaining strong groups. So there's a couple pillars to this norm. One of them is about really championing and being proud to be a part of a group. So doing things for God and for country. The other part has to do with the behaviors you're supposed to avoid. And those are specifically doing something that undermines your group and maybe benefits another group at the cost of your own. So don't be a traitor or don't fraternize with the enemy. And you can really see this norm activated when you look at the intense contempt that people can have for somebody that they perceive to be a traitor or a defector. Like the way that some people absolutely revile Edward Snowden because they think that him copying data from the National Security Association might have undermined the security interests of the United States. On a more positive note, you can see the depth of this in-group loyalty norm when you think about people who really prioritize their close friendship groups or teams or family. If you're somebody who might say family is one of the most important things in my life, then that might be a little bit of a reflection of the in-group loyalty norm. Okay, authority, respect. So if in-group loyalty kind of has to do with navigating the relationship between in-group versus out-group and trying to benefit your in-group, authority respect is about the relationship within a group, up and down a hierarchy. It implies deference to people who are your superiors, and also the responsibility that superiors should be good and just leaders and should take good care of the people that they have power over. And Haidt argues that authority helps us to preserve some degree of order within our groups. So, if you have a clear chain of command, and for the most part, people who have less power follow along with the orders and the guidance of people who have more power, you have a lot of clarity about the group's direction. So imagine how messy it would get if when Margie instituted, a new mission statement for the college or advocated for a new program, how messy it would get if Neil Weissman and the other deans could just decide whether or not they wanted to follow that policy. If there's confusion about who's calling the shots, things can get pretty chaotic. This also implies that you should really have a lot of respect for traditions. And this helps to maintain continuity in a group. If the norms are constantly changing and rituals are constantly being recycled, then you can kind of have this sense of losing your bearings, losing your moorings, and having confusion about what's correct. You might see your own adherence to authority respect norms if, for instance, rituals are really important to you. So maybe you're somebody who put a lot of effort into still having a Seder despite all the challenges of having to do this under lockdown. You might have Zoomed many of your family members across the country. Maybe you scrambled to get kind of the appropriate ceremonial foods despite the fact that there's grocery store shortages. But if this felt really deeply important for you to do, this might be a signal of the importance of authority/respect. Purity, sanctity. So, this is the one that's probably going to feel the least intuitive to start out with, but purity, sanctity has to do with the idea that there are certain things that are really sacred, and we shouldn't taint them. We shouldn't let them come in contact with things that are profane or debased. And Haidt argues that from an evolutionary perspective, this is about avoiding contamination. You're probably going to hear some echoes here of our discussion of disgust. So he's arguing that it originates with our reaction to, for instance, rotten food. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that you think that eating a rotten burger is pretty disgusting, but you wouldn't necessarily consider it immoral. However, consider, for instance, religious traditions that have strict rules about foods you can and can't eat. And the fact that, for instance, the Jewish and Muslim faiths consider pork to be a forbidden food partly have to do with the fact that pork tended to have a higher proportion of parasites and other pathogens. And so it was considered to be an impure food. Something that might be a little bit more intuitive to you is the sense that we can have that certain, for instance, sexual acts are actually immoral, not just a little bit gross or kind of unfamiliar, but even a little wrong. And if you're somebody who experiences a sense of discomfort with the idea of, for instance, people getting dressed up in mascot costumes in order to facilitate their own sexual arousal, i.e. furries, you might be showing a little bit of this purity moral norm. And Haidt argues that this is really about trying to keep a clean line between things that are civilized and humane versus things that seem more beastly or animal, in this case, kind of literally. And so we also would talk about spaces or ideas or objects that we consider sacred and not wanting to debase or taint these things. So let's say you're somebody who feels comfortable smoking and drinking and having sex, but you would never consider doing these things in a house of worship. Or maybe you're somebody for whom, a mosque or a temple or a church doesn't really mean much, but maybe you have other places that you consider really pure and kind of sacred. How would you feel, for instance, if you learned that somebody was planning to build a casino in the middle of Yosemite? Or think about the reactions that some people have to extreme body modification, where let's say your grandma or grandpa, if they saw a photo of this guy with his full body and facial tattoos, might not just think that this is a stupid life decision, but might actually think of it as a sort of bad, wrong, or perverse choice to make. Next class, we're really going to dive into this idea that there are strong individual differences in how people prioritize these 5 moral foundations. And some of these differences may actually tell us a lot about things like our current polarized political climate.